Welcome to the ClearAdmit MBA Admissions Academy. I'm Graham Richmond, and I'm joined by Alex Brown. This lesson is all about your resume, also known as your CV. So, Alex, why do we need a resume? We're not applying for a job,
Right.
but it does feel like most schools ask for a resume as part of the admissions process. So, what is it used for?
Well, as an admissions reader, it might be the first thing I look at. As an interviewer, it might be the first thing that I look at, and we'll talk about interviews a little bit later. But it's a nice synopsis of everything, right?
Yeah.
We talked about personal inventory in another in another episode, in another lesson, but here, this is, you're actually delivering it within the application package, like I say, I'm going to look at it quick as an admissions reader. That gives me a baseline to then start exploring other elements of the application.
And I would say, for me, I think of it as a nice, we talked about in an earlier lesson, personal inventory.
Yeah.
The resume is almost an expression of the greatest hits, like getting it into kind of a format. And I would argue it's a great initial step. Like if you're thinking about which piece of the application do you want to work on first, resume is not bad, or your data forms, the sort of general gathering of information, as opposed to diving in and writing an essay right off the bat. I feel like the resume is it's almost like an elevator pitch on paper of who you are. It has all the key, most people know a resume will have your education, your work experience. And in the case of business school, often you'll see a third section that covers sort of outside activities or interests or things that you're doing that keep you kind of well-rounded. So what about any kind of tips? We have there are a number of things that people want to keep in mind. Let's talk first about jargon, because I know it's a pet peeve of ours. What's the deal with jargon? Because everyone works in a specific domain and they have their own lingo. What do you do on the resume?
The reality is we all have a resume, right? So the temptation might be, I'm going to take my resume and I'm going to use it for business school.
Yeah.
The problem with that is, in your industry, if you're being recruited or you're interviewing for a job, the folks that are interviewing you know your industry and know your jargon and can interpret all that content. That's very good. When you're applying to business school, that's not going to be the case.
Right, and almost like, if you're applying for a job, you'd want the jargon to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about, right? Whereas in business school, I remember going back to that lesson we did on your admissions reader and knowing them. This is not someone who knows your industry. So very good point there. So remove the jargon.
Yeah.
Now, you and I sometimes disagree about the next thing that I wanted to talk about, which is, we talk about a resume having education, experience, and outside activities. Some resumes also have an objective.
Yeah.
And how would one use the objective if they're going to use it?
Yeah, it's always good that we can disagree on stuff, right? But this is very interesting, because if you have an objective statement, clearly the objective in this process is to pursue your MBA degree. That's redundant. We don't need to hear that as an objective in the resume. If you're going to use the objective statement, you want to tie it to those short and long-term goals. And where I find this particularly useful is in the resume you might bring to an interview. And that might be a slightly different resume that you actually submit for your application. So if I'm bringing a resume along to the interview, I might use that objective statement to describe why getting the MBA at this particular school, because I'm interviewing at that particular school, makes sense in the context of my objective, which is now my short and long-term goals.
Right.
Why does that really help as an interviewer? I might be interviewing 20 people that day and I'm having to make a lot of notes. Well, if that piece of it's already in the resume, I don't have to write it down.
Right. So, I know this is one where you and I disagree in the sense that my view is that, for the resume that you submit with the application, at least, I don't need the objective on there. I feel like a lot of schools ask for your goals in the data form or in an essay. But I understand. And I think the key piece of advice here, though, I think is don't write, my objective is to get an MBA at this school, because that's, as you say, redundant. One of the things I'm really passionate about, and I think you would agree, is that when you have bullet points on your resume to describe your work or really anything that you're doing, they need to start with what we call action verbs.
Yeah.
And ideally, for me, the verbs need to be mixed up. Like you don't want to have the same kind of managed, or led. Like you really want to have, initiated, innovated, created, managed could be one of them too. But keep it mixed up and use action verbs to show that you're actively doing stuff at work and taking charge. So I think that's an important point. And we have, somewhere on the Clear Admit website, we actually have a list of what we call a kind of action verb list. So definitely worth investigating. I know it's also in the resume guide that we have as well. Right. And there's literally a list of like 100 verbs because I think it can be challenging to come up with, the right words to use. What else? Other stuff. What about how do you express accomplishments on a resume?
Yeah. I mean, use metrics to sort of show your successes, whether it's sort of increased sales by a certain portion, increased geography, or reduced costs. Whatever the success is, you want to show the measurement becomes that sort of means of translation. So when I'm looking at your resume real quick, I can get a good sense of what your successes have been. So showing the numbers is good.
Yeah, so quantifying the success, really important. Yeah. Now, here's another one. I feel like every year there are people going through the MBA admissions process who insist on having a 2-page or more resume, when we know most schools that ask for a resume, some of them will explicitly say 1 page. Some of them don't, but if a school doesn't say it, can you submit a 2 or 3-page resume? What's your view on that?
I don't think it's smart to do that for a couple of reasons. One is, you're 3, 4, or 5 years into your career, you should be able to get it all onto 1 page. I can, and I'm 26 or 7 years old. No, I might be 35 years into my career. But in any event, you should be able to get it on 1 page. And I think if you're needing 2 pages, it's a little bit arrogant, quite frankly, because everyone else is managing to get it on 1 page. And you don't want to create additional work for your readers. So digesting a 1-page resume is going to be easier for the admissions reader than dealing with a 2-page resume.
Yeah, no, I could not agree more. And I think I once heard that, for every 10 years of experience, you might be afforded an additional page on the resume. But people applying to business school, there are very few with 10 years of experience, of full-time professional experience. So get it on 1 page, absolutely. I guess one of the things that I think, from my perspective, I like a resume that starts with education and then has experience and then has outside activities. And the reason for me is that in the admissions reader's mind, you're often assessing the candidate's academic background, then their professional experience, and then their other activities. And so I like it in that order. Plus, they're applying to an academic program. Yeah. So seeing their academic experience first helps me. I know some people will reverse that and they'll have, experience followed by education. Did you have a preference when you were reading at Wharton, or?
I don't particularly have a preference, but I agree with the logic of your preference for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to really dive in on is that outside activities or that extras space. We see people using titles like other skills and activities, or it can be a place where you list languages that you speak. Some people will have a hobbies line where they'll just have a single bullet point says hobbies, and they'll say, road cycling, French film, sushi making, like whatever they want to put on. And sometimes those little bullet points in that extra section can really bring a candidate to life and help them to stand out a bit. But it's certainly a place where you would list formally your, volunteer work or any really, outside activities that are around a group or where you have some milestones. And I would argue that you would list those much in the way that you would list your work experience, right? I mean, I think you would have...
No, absolutely. And recognize that all this stuff you're going to expand upon in the data forms, in the essays, maybe even in the recs, and certainly in the interviews. So it's not this is the only place you're putting your hobbies and your activities, but it's a great balance with your work experience and everything in that 1-page resume. And think about it. If this is the first thing that your admissions reader is reading, you've got to think about how do you set the right balance and the right tone before they dive deeper into your candidacy. And, psychology studies will tell you first impressions matter. That resume, that's your first impression.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're bringing it in many cases to an interview with someone who hasn't read your file in some instances where schools are doing those types of interviews. And I think yeah, sometimes those little bullet points in the extras section can be a conversation starter or an icebreaker. Or so I agree with you though. The whole thing is a first impression, and that's why we talk about you go from personal inventory to kind of getting it into a distilled elevator pitch, which really is the resume in some respects. So a very important piece of this puzzle. Yeah. So next up in the Admissions Academy, we're going to talk about data forms, which are kind of related to the resume. So stay tuned for that.